Alrighty, welcome back to the Modern Josephus, as we're going to keep on going over the history of the Christian Church, and today we're going to look at Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Okay, so before we jump into today's topic, let me first address a few things that came up in the comment section on episode 1. First of all, the word extinct. So for example, I indicated on the chart that the Arian Christians went extinct, while many people pointed out that the Jehovah's Witnesses are very Arian in their theology, which is true. I therefore want to clarify that whenever I show a group going extinct on this chart, I'm always referring to the original group, not to similar groups that may arise later. This is especially important with regard to Jewish Christians. I got a lot of comments from people pointing out that Messianic Jews still exist. Again, this is correct. However, Messianic Jews do not trace a line all the way back to the original Jewish Christians from ancient times. Rather, Messianic Jews are more recent converts. So, in order to make things more clear, I decided to change the label Jewish Christians to Ebionite Christians. The Ebionites being one of the early Jewish Christian sects, similar to or the same as the Nazarenes.
And it makes sense because, as I noted before, the Pauline Christians were a mix of Jews and Gentiles.
I also received several requests to include the Samaritans and the Karaites, so let's go ahead and add them to the chart. Now, some people, including the Samaritans themselves, think that the Samaritan religion is a direct continuation of the religion followed by the northern kingdom of Israel.
I didn't even know that this existed.
Prior to the Babylonian exile. However, from an academic perspective, it's more likely that the Samaritans emerged early on in the Second Temple period, when around 450 BCE, they built their own temple on Mount Gerizim. Now, there's a lot more I could say about the Samaritans, but since this series is focused on Christianity, I'll perhaps have to make a separate video about them at some other point.
That'd be
what about the
interesting.
Karaites? If you haven't heard about them, basically the Karaites are Jews who do not accept the teachings of the early rabbis, as recorded in the Talmud. According to some people, they are the direct descendants of the Sadducees. However, the scholarly consensus is that this is not the case, because the Karaites did not actually emerge until the medieval period, which means that it is better to see them as an early breakaway group from Rabbinic Judaism, rather than being completely distinct from it.
So my question is, are they Old Testament based? Like, is that what they are? That's interesting. I won't do a separate video because this is the history of Christianity, but that's a question I'm interested in.
Another such breakaway group is Beta Israel, aka the Ethiopian Jews. Again, some people theorize that this group can trace their origins to pre-rabbinic times. However, it is clear from their language and customs that they did originally have connections to rabbinic Jews, but then this connection was severed for many centuries until they were once again reunited with the rest of Judaism in modern times. Okay, let's now turn our attention back to early Christianity. I mentioned last time something called the Pentarchy. The Pentarchy emerged in some sort of official way around the time of the Council of Chalcedon. Basically, by this point, there were 5 major cities that were key centers of Christianity within the Roman Empire. Originally, there had been just 3, Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. But when Constantinople became the new capital of the Roman Empire, it became important as well. And then there was, of course, Jerusalem, where the whole thing began. So by 451, the leaders of the church recognized 5 key cities.
It's interesting because Antioch was actually the first place where they called Christians Christians, according to Acts.
Each was called a patriarchate because each was governed by a special bishop called a patriarch, meaning father. Now, I changed the chart a little bit to make what happened after the Council of Chalcedon a bit more clear. Basically, the majority of Christians in Alexandria, Egypt, and in Antioch, Syria, did not agree with the Chalcedonian decisions. They therefore broke away from the rest and eventually became known as Oriental Orthodoxy, which is distinct from Eastern Orthodoxy. These days, the two largest churches within Oriental Orthodoxy are the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt and the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which became independent from the Patriarch of Alexandria in 1959. However, I should point out that the church in Ethiopia has its own very unique history that goes all the way back to ancient times. And as I discussed in my series on Who Wrote the Bible, Ethiopian Christians have a unique version of the Bible that includes several extra books that are not found in most other Bibles. Also, since I mistakenly didn't show a photo of the Ethiopian Patriarch last time, I wanted to show him this time. This is Patriarch Abun Matthias, the spiritual leader of around 40 million Ethiopian Christians. Okay, so let's now return to the Pentarchy. Although most of the Christians in Alexandria and Antioch became Oriental Orthodox, a minority did not.
It's interesting because Ethiopian Christians, I believe, trace themselves back to the Ethiopian that was the Ethiopian eunuch who was converted by Philip.
That's why I also show dotted lines that stay within the Eastern Orthodox section, which I've now decided to color red. The Christians in these areas that sided with Eastern Orthodoxy were originally known as Melkites, meaning imperial. That term will pop up again later, so I thought I'd point out its meaning now. But here's the thing. In the 600s CE, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem came under the control of the new religion of Islam. Therefore, these cities became less important in terms of Christian leadership, leaving only Rome and Constantinople as the two main patriarchates. Therefore, a bit of a power struggle eventually developed between Rome and Constantinople. On one side, there was the fact that Rome, as the original seat of imperial power, had been given, back in the early days of the Pentarchy, a sort of precedence over the other four cities.
More like they took the precedence, or maybe, as he said, it had to do with imperial thing. It did not have to do with anything from the Bible where it says that Rome and Peter and all this kind of stuff. That's not where it comes from. It comes from Rome was the seat of power, and so the bishop of Rome decided, oh, you know what? I'm in the capital, and I should have the preeminence over everybody else. And of course, the patriarch in Constantinople wasn't going to have any of that.
However, on the other side, there was the fact that Constantinople was now the seat of imperial power. And it was the Greek emperor in Constantinople that now appointed the Latin pope over in Rome. As the centuries went by, Rome and Constantinople drifted further and further apart as Europe became divided between the Holy Roman Empire in the west and the Byzantine Empire in the east. This came to a head in 1054 with what's called the Great Schism. The Great Schism can be blamed on many different things, but I'd like to point out just two. One was a disagreement over whether or not Rome and its bishop, the Pope, was the head over the entire Christian church.
And this, I think, proves that the Pope being the head of the church isn't biblical or traditional. Because this didn't come to a head until here. Because previously, they didn't debate who was the Pope, because none of them saw each other as Pope or head or supreme head over all of Christianity. None of them did. And you can prove that by this schism right here.
According to Constantinople, the Pope was just a first among equals.
Yeah.
In other words, he held a special place of honor, but in practical terms, he held no more power than the Patriarch of Constantinople. However,
and probably no more power than any of the other bishops in other churches.
However, according to Rome, the Pope did have actual authority over the entire church. The other major difference related to the Nicene Creed, which I discussed in episode 1. In fact, I created a bit of a stir because, as an example, I showed the version of the creed used these days by Catholics and Protestants, rather than the one used by Eastern Orthodox Christians. The difference is this line here, known as the filioque, meaning "and from the Son." So, as you can see, Catholics and Protestants say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, whereas the Eastern Orthodox Christians say that he proceeds from the Father only. Because of these differences and many others, East and West parted ways in 1054. Now, I should make it clear that it would be incorrect to say that the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church started only in 1054. Instead, it would be more accurate to say that they both started in the 1st century and that they were simply united up until 1054. So what about the popes then? I mean, the ones from Peter up until Pope Leo IX in 1054. Well, the difference is that Catholics claim that those popes were the leaders of the entire Christian church, whereas in the view of the Eastern Orthodox Church, these popes were simply the bishops of Rome, who, as I mentioned earlier, were, in their minds, simply the first among equals.
And I'm sure that, those deriving from the Patriarch of Alexandria and the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Patriarch of Israel, all those groups would also see it that way too.
Okay, so let's now look at how each of these churches are organized today, starting with the Eastern Orthodox Church, which sees itself as a single church, but can actually be divided into 15 equal churches, called autocephalous churches.
And I would say that we Baptists have our churchology, our view of the church, I guess, would more align with what the Greek Orthodox has it set up, where all these different churches are each independent from each other. They have their own bishop, their own leader, things like that. Of course, we go to an even smaller scale because here I'm seeing like sometimes even nationwide, but we go even smaller scale. But I think the reason why they have that is because that's how the Old Testament churches were, or the early 1st century churches were. There was no supreme pope like the Catholics believe, no supreme leader. No, there's a whole bunch of bishops and each one has authority over their own church, and it's among equals. And amongst us Baptists, the different pastors and the different church leaders are equals. There's no head over anybody.
Basically, being autocephalous means that the leader of that church does not have to answer to anyone higher up, other than God, of course. However, the Patriarch of Constantinople is given special precedence and is considered first among equals. This is why the Patriarch of Constantinople is called the Ecumenical Patriarch.
And there is where we would separate from the Eastern Orthodox. We Baptists don't have one first among equals. No, we just have equals among equals.
Ecumenical meaning representing more than one group. Currently, that position is held by Bartholomew I. Initially, the Eastern Orthodox Church consisted of only 5 autocephalous churches. These were the 4 out of the 5 patriarchates from the Pentarchy, as well as the Church of Cyprus, which had always been seen as being independent, all the way back to ancient times.
Cyprus, that's where, Paul went there first with Barnabas, and then Barnabas ended up just being there a lot, and establishing a church there and things. But anyway, I was going to say something else. Can't remember. Anyway, moving on.
However, over time, more autocephalous churches were added by Constantinople, such as the Bulgarian Orthodox Church in 927, the Serbian Orthodox Church in 1219, and most importantly, the Russian Orthodox Church in 1589. I say most importantly because nowadays the Russian Orthodox Church is by far the largest of the various Eastern Orthodox churches. It is currently led by Kirill, who holds the title Patriarch of Moscow. The Church of Greece and the Romanian Orthodox Church were the next two Eastern Orthodox churches to become autocephalous in 1850 and 1885, which is after each became independent from the Ottoman Empire.
What I was going to say is, if you notice, a lot of these bishops look very, like the ones with black robes and stuff, they look very, very Jewish. You know, they remind me of, you know, it's like I don't know, it kind of reminds me of what maybe the apostles looked like back in the day. Anyway, not to be funny, just, you know, it's like there's that connection.
The remaining five churches all became autocephalous in the 20th century, or in the case of the Macedonian church, just last year in 2022. Which leaves two gray areas to discuss. The first being the Orthodox Church in America, which originated as a branch of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Patriarch of Moscow currently recognizes the American Church as being autocephalous, but the Patriarch of Constantinople does not. When it comes to Ukraine, we get the opposite situation. There, the Patriarch of Constantinople recognizes the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but the Patriarch of Moscow does not. And it's even more complicated than that.
So, the Patriarch of Constantinople, is that still in Constantinople, or where is it? Let me know in the comments below.
And that's because the history of Russia and Ukraine is, well, a bit complicated. You see, both countries trace their origins back to a medieval state called Kievan Rus, which was centered on the city of Kiev. When Christianity first reached that area, the church there was known as the Ruthenian Orthodox Church. However, over time, Kievan Rus disintegrated, and instead the city of Moscow became the dominant city in the region. It was at this point that the Russian Orthodox Church was established, replacing the Ruthenian Orthodox Church. Eventually, all Eastern Orthodox Christians in Ukraine ended up under the jurisdiction of Moscow. However, after the fall of the Russian Empire, some churches in Ukraine declared independence and started calling themselves the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, or UAOC. This church operated separately from the UOC, which still came under the jurisdiction of Moscow. This is why later the letters MP were added to the name, to make it clear that it is part of the Moscow Patriarchate. To complicate matters further, a third Ukrainian church emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union. This one called itself the UOC-KP, the KP standing for Kiev Patriarchate. Now, obviously, having three different Eastern Orthodox churches in one country is not ideal. So, in 2018, there was an attempt to merge all three churches into a single church, which would become known as the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. The merger was mostly successful, and now around 80% of Eastern Orthodox Christians in Ukraine belong to the OCU. However, it wasn't entirely successful. For one thing, there are still some churches that are attached to Moscow, although since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, these are becoming less. And officially, the UOCMP has now cut ties with the Russian Orthodox Church. Secondly, there was also a disagreement between the newly appointed leader of the OCU, Epiphanius, and the former leader of the UOCKP, Filaret. This disagreement led to Filaret attempting to revive the UOCKP, although so far he's had only limited success. So basically, while there is still some disunity, the new OCU is now the main Eastern Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Now, before we move on, I do want to point out the growing rift between the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople and the Patriarch of Moscow. For over 500 years now, Moscow has seen itself as being the Third Rome, And since the Russian Orthodox Church is by far the largest of the various Eastern Orthodox churches, it has at times been seen as a sort of rival to the leadership of Constantinople. In fact, when the ecumenical patriarch recognized the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Moscow decided to break communion with Constantinople.
Notice that the Eastern Orthodox Church is very, very down to earth. You know, it's very simple, like the New Testament churches were. And I think that speaks volumes there.
Which basically means that they're no longer on good speaking terms. This was made even worse when Patriarch Kirill came out as a strong supporter of the war on Ukraine, whereas Patriarch Bartholomew strongly opposed it. So it's yet to be seen whether or not the current schism will turn out to be a landscape-changing, permanent one. Okay, let's now talk about the Roman...
All right, we'll leave it there. This video has been pretty long, and then we'll get back to the Roman Catholic Church in the next video. Hopefully you learned something about my view and my Baptist point of view of church history. Hopefully I made myself understood. You can disagree or agree. Doesn't really bother me. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.